Hi, I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Paul R. Ehrlich. He's been a household name since the publication of his 1968 bestseller, The Population Bomb. He's Bing Professor of Population Studies, Emeritus, and President of the Center of Conservation Biology at Stanford University. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a recipient of the Crafoord Prize, an explicit substitute for the Nobel Prize in fields of science where the latter is not given, the Blue Planet Prize, and numerous other international honors. He investigates a wide range of topics in population biology, ecology, evolution, human ecology, and environmental science. Much of his current effort is focused on the mechanisms of human cultural evolution and ways of directing that evolution to ameliorate the human predicament. So first off, thank you for your decades of wonderful work, and second, thank you for being on the program.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. My voice isn't as strong as it used to be, I'm afraid. But I'm still used to blabbing, and I wish I could say I thought that all the effort you and I and others have put into making more human well-being and a better environment for human beings hasn't been too successful. And in the United States right now, as you may know, we have a cacistocracy where the president and his buddies are trying to make it worse and succeeding. I'll try and say something cheery, however, during this talk, and in part, I can say that I think the most recent thing I've been involved in, which is very embarrassing to me, actually has the potential for making a lot of people better off, at least in the short term.
Well, so let's talk about that. The first sentence of the introduction to your new book, Jaws, is, "This is a story about a vast and serious epidemic afflicting the developed world increasingly over the last few centuries, one that's gone virtually unrecognized." So what is this epidemic that you're talking about?
Well, let me tell you first how I learned to recognize it, because I'm very embarrassed by that. I'm basically originally an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist, and I've been doing a lot of work on the extinction crisis, and a lot of that work has been in collaboration with a colleague from the National University of Mexico, Gerardo Ceballos, who's also
I've interviewed him.
Sorry?
I've interviewed him. He's great.
Oh, yeah, okay. And he had been working with a couple that had built a eco-resort near Zihuatanejo in Mexico, and they had formed an NGO that was attempting to preserve the jaguar in Mexico. And Gerardo and I have been working together for years. And quite naturally, when he was visiting me once, he introduced me and Anne to Sandra Kahn and her husband David Leventhal. Sandra was born in Mexico, but is a U.S. citizen and an orthodontist. And her husband is an entrepreneur who was doing the conservation and eco-resort stuff. And we discovered that we had a common interest. They live right here in the Bay Area. And we discovered that we had a common interest in fermented grape juice. I don't know if you've ever tried that. Fermented grape juice is sometimes called wine out here in California. And in a series of dinners in which we tested a lot of fermented grape juice, Sandra began telling me of her problems with orthodonture and how she was very unhappy with using the technique she'd been trained to use on her own kids. And that led to a discussion which basically, after a couple of years, led to the book Jaws, because what I hadn't thought about as an evolutionary biologist and ecologist was why people had wisdom teeth that had to be unimpacted, why they had crooked teeth to begin with, what the story was, and it gradually, I shouldn't say dawned on me through Sandra's help, that the basic cause was the biggest environmental change that human beings have made on the planet. And that change was, first of all, settling down to practice agriculture, and then with agriculture being able, when one person could feed more than his own family or her own family, to specialization. So you got mechanics and priests and soldiers and scientists, led to industrialization. And the industrialization, the combination of settling down to practice agriculture and industrialization, was a huge environmental change, and that we had brought our hunter-gatherer genes into a brand new, dramatically changed environment where we've had nowhere near enough time to adapt genetically to it. And so we have tried to adapt environmentally and largely failed. And the basic result, I'll give you some more detail if you want it, but the basic result is our jaws have shrunk. There's no longer room for a full row of molars, so we often get wisdom teeth that don't have room to erupt. Teeth become crooked because there's not enough room for them in the smaller jaw. And another factor in this whole thing is mouth breathing, because moving indoors, in the industrial age, we've moved to where the allergens are, including things that didn't exist before, like formaldehyde. So kids tend to have stuffy noses for the early parts of their lives. And if you stuff a monkey's nose, its jaw development goes to hell. And if you stuff a child's nose, its jaw development goes to hell, along with the fact that it doesn't get to exercise its jaws properly. They don't develop right. Think about it for a minute. For some reason, we have separated the health of the jaws and mouth from the health of the rest of the body and invented a whole group of healthcare providers that are different for the jaws. They're called dentists or orthodontists instead of doctors. And you're advised by doctors to exercise every one of your striated muscles as much as possible to remain healthy. But dentists, with some rare exceptions, don't recommend that you exercise your jaw muscles and tongue for exactly the same reasons. And so we suffering from maldevelopment of the jaws. And you say, well, what the hell, we can still chew. But that's not the important point. There isn't room. The critical point is there isn't room in your jaw for your tongue to lie entirely within the jaw. So when you go to sleep and sleep on your back, very often the tongue slops into your airway. And if it slops into your airway, you may start doing something you've heard of called snoring. Now, usually that doesn't happen until you're old enough for your muscles to lose tone and so on. But more and more kids are beginning to snore. As far as we know, people never snored in the past. And the snoring leads to actual blocking of the airway in the middle of the night, often a disease called sleep apnea. You're awakened because you're choking and not getting enough air. It triggers a flight or fight response, which is very dangerous to have triggered if you don't need to fly or fight. And that leads to stress. And that we now know helps develop cancer, heart disease, ADHD, even Alzheimer's disease, depression, and so on. It's a huge health problem. And I've just discovered since we wrote the book, many friends who are on CPAP machines at night to try to keep their airway open. And of course, braces have become common on kids. And braces usually do the wrong thing, not the right thing. They're cosmetic, but they're not aimed at the health of the airway. And as my colleague Richard Klein, who's the world's best, or he and Dan Lieberman at Harvard agree they're the world's best human paleontologists, neither of them has ever seen a hunter-gatherer skull with crooked teeth or with unerupted wisdom teeth. They have the normal molars. So there is a short sermon on why we should be doing things differently if we want our kids to be healthier, and for ourselves, if you're young enough to do something about it, to be healthier.
So
end of sermon.
So that seems incredibly important to me. And can we back up and make a couple linkages? So
sure.
Can you what is the problem that leads to the? So you're saying that our jaws end up being, that our mouth, that our faces end up being narrower.
Our jaws develop more narrowly. There's an accompanying epidemic of hanging the mouth open. If you look at kids when they're not playing computer games, talking or eating, they tend to hang their mouths open. If you force a monkey to hang its mouth open, its jaw doesn't develop right, gets very narrow. not enough room for the teeth and tongue. Those experiments were done some time ago, but in the book Jaws, there are pictures of the experiments done on monkeys and lots of pictures of people suffering in various ways. For instance, there's one picture showing a grandfather who lived in a, I hate to say the term primitive, but you know what I mean, primitive community, beautifully developed face and jaws. Then there's the son who, after 20 years or so, moved into a city, and you can see the jaws starting to go to hell. And then there's the grandson who was raised in the city, and the jaws much, much worse. And there's all kinds of evidence. If, for example, they excavated a Scandinavian graveyard of 300 years ago, measured the jaws, and compared the measurements with modern Scandinavians, and the jaws are still shrinking. And it makes sense. You know, think of what a kid's legs would look like if they weren't allowed to walk until they were 10 or 11. In other words, your genes have to interact with an environment, and they're designed to interact with an environment which no longer exists if they're going to develop properly. And the point is that they were designed when people, first of all, nursed for 2 or 3 or 4 years, kids nursed, then they were weaned to food they had to chew. Not the baby food industry is a disaster. It produces liquids and pap. We are now generally turning our entire diet liquid. Think about it. When did you last chew a fruit besides an apple? The fruits that we can buy here in Palo Alto, you could poke a hole in a peach and suck out its contents, damn near liquid. Cool. Hamburgers are close to liquid. I had a filet the other day, which I almost could have drunk. When did you last go to a restaurant or at home, have something that you really chewed on, like your ancestors 10,000 years ago cutting a chunk off of a buffalo, roasting it over a fire, and then tearing pieces off with your teeth, and maybe cutting between your mouth with a knife, just missing your nose to cut off the piece, and then chewing on it for 20 minutes. Between cooking utensils and forming a liquid diet, we have basically destroyed the way our jaws evolved to develop. And unfortunately, if we had a generation every 20 minutes, we could have adapted to it by now. But unfortunately, we have a generation every 20 years. And even if there was strong selection pressure, there's nowhere near been enough time for us to adjust genetically to this brand new, dramatically different environment.
So just so I make sure that I understand what you're saying, that we don't get the chewing exercise that our ancestors did, certainly 10,000 years ago, but even 300 years ago. We're not getting the same sort of exercise, and that's
ruining our jaws and making our teeth crooked and giving us all kinds of diseases because it interrupts our sleep. And interestingly, actually I've been talking to people at Stanford who are looking at how Stanford students are fed, and colleagues who are interested in public health. They all, basically like me, hadn't thought about this stuff. And one of the things that Sandra Kahn is the senior author on the book, my colleague who's an orthodontist, we've been unable to get a really good idea of the progression of toughness, from toughness to tenderness in food through historic time. In other words, we can figure out when the meat grinder was first invented and so on. But although there's a literature on the nutritional content of food through time, its consistency hasn't been measured. And it's very difficult to get the data on, for example, how much did the diet get soft as sugars were imported from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere, so that people began to make cakes which were quite soft to eat. Did they replace tougher foods and so on? There's a whole huge area here that needs investigation. What's crystal clear is combination of stuffy noses and inadequate nursing, weaning, and chewing, and not holding the jaws with proper posture. Kids used to be trained, but no longer are, to keep their jaws when they're not chewing or talking. Keep their jaws shut, teeth lightly in contact, tongue up against the front of the roof of the mouth. That's the gradual pressure caused by that is a main determinant of how big your jaw grows. So we haven't even done enough work on jaw development specifically, but the basic outline is very clear. Again, my two colleagues who spend their time looking at human skeletons through time have never run into an ancient skull with crooked teeth. Worn down maybe, missing maybe, but not crooked, and no sign of so-called wisdom teeth cause basically an epidemic that will end up with Sandra and me being sued by Lamborghini and Porsche and Lexus and so on, because those companies are supported by oral surgeons, and about 65% of wisdom tooth extractions are unnecessary and just cause misery and disease. We have an epidemic of physician-caused health because of the pattern of removing, not having enough room for the wisdom teeth to erupt, and then overrating the difficulty of the lack of eruption. And we give this National Institutes of Health data. Oh, by the way, there's 400 references roughly in JAWS, so it's a book written for parents and lay people, but virtually every statement in it is backed by references to the scientific literature.
You know, before there's a couple directions I want to go. One of them, I just want to mention that when I was a teenager, they took out my wisdom teeth, and also before I got braces, they pulled like another 4 teeth or 5 teeth or 3 teeth or something. They pulled more teeth besides the wisdom teeth.
Did exactly the wrong thing.
Because
I hate to tell you, I'm guilty. I had my wisdom teeth removed too, and I never thought I was an adult. I never had to have braces, but I just accepted the dentist saying you should have your wisdom teeth out. They just spotted them in an X-ray. I don't have any idea if I'd left them in whether I would have had any problem. The odds were if I'd left them in less than 50-50 that I'd never have any problem with them.
Well, it is an extraordinary thing that, we presume generally that, there is great wisdom and intelligence in time, such that sharks end up with a skin that is the right texture to enable great speed. And we see this with all sorts of things, and it does. This is something that even before I became politicized or understood anything really, I did sort of wonder, why do we have wisdom teeth if everybody has them out? And
I see, I'm guiltier than you are. My business is evolution, and I never thought of those issues until Sandra began to talk with me about them. And remember, orthodontists are great people. They're interested in helping people. They're interested in, obviously, appearance is important in our society. There's a huge data showing the better looking you are by our social standards, the more money you make, the more likely you are to be elected, the more friends you're likely to have, and so on. So orthodontists are trying to do the right thing, but their training was terrible, and the medical profession and people like me, evolutionists, didn't think properly about this issue. We didn't recognize the gigantic evolutionary change that had to be culturally evolutionary because of our huge change in the environment. And, things might, if we went on for another 2,000, 3,000 years and people with small jaws didn't reproduce as well as ones with larger jaws, the jaw could expand again. But we really haven't got thousands of years to wait. We've got to change our environment to some degree back. For instance, Sandra and I are going to be hated by parents because we're recommending chewing gum In fact, Sandra's found a gum that's produced on an island in Greece that you can re-chew, and it's tough to chew, and it doesn't taste bad. And we think kids ought to be encouraged to chew gum as early as possible. That while you watch to make sure they don't choke, young kids ought to be given tough stuff to eat as soon as they're ready to be weaned, and let them work their jaws. To give you an example, which is semi-personal, but Sandra wouldn't mind me telling you, she was very aware as a working mother that of the nutritional value of mother's milk. I think almost everybody is now. But as an orthodontist and a working mother, she pumped her breast milk for the day and left it with a caregiver or her husband to feed their kids through a bottle. And it turns out, which she didn't know, let alone I didn't know, that nursing exercises a baby's jaw muscles much, much more than drinking from the mother's milk from a bottle. In other words, there's a whole series of surprises for me that I find almost embarrassing to talk about, because this is one of the things that in retrospect is crystal clear. And in fact, that's been our experience. The book is a non-profit book. Any money that comes from it will go to, both of us have an institute trying to improve human well-being, and that's where it'll go. But when we started on it, we found all kinds of people saying, yeah, I'm on a CPAP machine. Yeah, that's right. The director of published by Stanford University Press, director of Stanford University Press has had most of the problems of things that come from things like too many extractions in the course of orthodontic treatment. One of my colleagues' wives, who I've known for decades and who we've worked together for decades, has had her life turned to misery by sleep apnea and trying to deal with it surgically and so on. So this is one of these things that's everywhere out there, but it hasn't been put together in a systematic way before. And now that the book is out, as they were discovering things that relate to it, like moving indoors not only puts you in touch with all those allergens, but puts you in touch with a different light regime and with your eyes not focusing at a distance so much. And we're getting an epidemic globally of nearsightedness, of myopia, which can lead to retinal detachment, among other problems. So moving indoors and changing our diets to a different consistency has been a huge change, and we've had all kinds of reaction to it, and it hasn't been recognized and put together into a coherent story yet for humanity.
So I want to talk more about some tangible things like the chewing gum in a minute, but before then I want to read a paragraph from the preface that has to do with a lot of what you've been talking about. Here it is. Human cultural evolution has been one long string of examples of the law of unexpected consequences. We invent agriculture, which leads to food surpluses, which leads to job specialization, and before you know it, we've invented socioeconomic status, the most crushing way of subordinating the low ranking that primates have ever seen. We invent sedentary dwelling and permanent structures, and soon we're dealing with the public health consequence of something no self-respecting primate would ever do, living in high-density populations in close proximity to its feces. We domesticate wolves into being companions, and soon we're dressing up our dogs in Halloween costumes and buying pet rocks. The emergence of modern humans has generated some surprising twists and turns. So it seems that so much of your work, and you'd have no way of knowing this, but most of my work too, is about these sort of unintended consequences. You attempt to invent, here's a great example. It's a small example, but there were great concerns about horse manure in cities back up until about the turn of the 20th century. And there were predictions that horse manure would be piled up to the third story in Manhattan, and cities just stunk terribly. And they tried all sorts of things to fix it. They thought that trains would fix it, but trains actually made up more horses because it made more transportation into the city, and then they had to be transported around the city by cart. And then what stopped it was cars. So they solved the horse poop problem and created the car problem. And
then created the climate change problem.
Exactly. And so...
Sure. Do, by the way, if you don't mind telling your listeners.
I'm sorry?
What do you do? How are you involved in this, if you don't mind?
I'm a writer. I've got like 25 books out on environmental issues and basically trying to figure out why this culture destroys everything and how we can stop it from killing the planet.
Great.
And I'll send you a book. We'll talk about that later.
Okay.
Anyway, so can you talk more about these sort of unintended consequences? I mean, that's what this whole book is about, and that's what so much of this is about, but can you just talk about that idea
right.
a bit more?
One of my big concerns, and probably yours from what you say, is how the hell we're going to feed. We're not doing a very good job at feeding 7.5 billion people today. The statistics show that roughly 750 million are hungry, another couple billion micronutrient malnourished, which doesn't let them perform very well, and yet we're going to 11 or more by the end of the century. How are we going to feed them? And you talk about unintended consequences. We were all extremely worried about that situation in the mid-60s when there was a huge famine in India and so on, and the so-called Green Revolution greatly increased production. And that seemed like an excellent, and still bragged about today as an excellent solution. But what it led to was a great our crops becoming much more uniform genetically, planting huge areas in the same strain of crop. And that led to them being very vulnerable to pests, and worse yet, losing a lot of the genetic variability that we wish we had now in order to create new strains that may be more productive, for example, in changed climates, because, of course, the biggest impact of climate disruption is likely to be difficulty with the agricultural system, which is already showing up. So an unintended consequence of feeding a lot of people was, A, make the agricultural system in general more vulnerable to climate change. B, it's take the pressure off people to do something about controlling the size of the human population. And feeding the human population, of course, contributes about a third of climate disruption. In other words, the food system puts about a third of the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So all these are unintended consequences, and there are lots of others. You take any big move that humanity has made, and it's had these unintended consequences. Obviously, I used to like tough steaks. I'm fortunate in that way because I think they're tastier, or at least I used to think they were tastier than filet. But nowadays you can't find a tough steak to chew in a restaurant. They won't serve it to you. So that's an unintended consequence, is that my jaws would be in better shape if I had stuck with tough foods. But it's hard to do these days, and in fact, the trend is all going in the opposite direction. So you're absolutely right. Unintended consequences are essentially everywhere, and one of the things we ought to learn is to pay more attention to predicting them and trying to deal with them when we make changes.
You know, it just kills me that we humans tend to, or humans in this culture at least, tend to consider ourselves the smartest beings on the planet, but we seem somehow surprised that, you know, if you put in a dam, that it kills anadromous fish. What a surprise. Yeah. Or if you intentionally make a substance, plastic, that is not food for anyone, it doesn't decay, then it ends up accumulating. And
putting itself with poisons.
Yes. And so it just...
Of course, your blood-brain barrier. I mean, Homo sapiens was a bad naming issue, but I think we have evolved very rapidly technologically, but we have not evolved to take the long-term view. And I'm not sure why our cultural evolution has gone so fast in technology and so slow in ethics and thought about the future and so on, except that, again, we never in our evolutionary history had to pay attention to changes in the ecological background, and that's what we have to pay attention to now.
Right.
And I include in the ecological background the things we're doing socially, like, again, building nuclear weapons. Give me a reason why we and the Russians should have so many nuclear weapons that we could wipe out civilization 10 or 20 times over. We have weapons aimed at the tiniest targets in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and the whole system is on hair trigger alert. We've had many close calls to blowing up the entire world, and yet there are people like Bolton and so on who are stupid enough to not realize that we shouldn't be risking all of civilization on today's political disputes, particularly when, as resources get scarcer, the disputes are going to be nastier, and the urge to fight likely to become even greater when we have massive, as we're going to have, we've already started massive migratory movements and so on. We're not doing any planning for it. To give just a single example, as you know, in countries in Europe have faced floods of refugees from Syria, from Africa, and so on, all of which are likely to get much worse. And yet they've done no planning for how to handle them and how to share the costs. That is, if the huge expansion of population in Africa leads to huge numbers of people moving to Spain and Italy, what share in that, in taking care of that problem, should the British and the Germans use, or Swedes contribute? In other words, there's no set of treaties or anything to even try and deal with that problem, which is a super obvious one that Europe is going to face over the next few decades. So, we're not good at that kind of thing.
Yeah, and one of the things that I loved about Jaws is that it is such a great example of, we can talk about the larger scale unintended consequences, like the anadromous fish, like the plastic, like any of the ones you mentioned, and then one of the things I love about Jaws is it brings it back to, how much more intimate can it be than the shape of your face and your health. And
one of the that I like about it is, and why I got so deeply involved, as you can tell, is when you think about the fish problem, the andromedous fish, the problem of the Green Revolution and all that, there's not much you can do. Do you have children?
No.
No. Well, if you have kids, there's not much you can do to protect them from climate change or from the loss of the fish species or fish populations and so on. This is something that you can actually have direct influence on how it hits you, your family, your loved ones, other people. Most of the people I work with are concerned now, mostly at the planning and consideration level, with if there's enough left after the coming collapse, how do you redesign a system that won't just lead to another collapse? That's 10,000 foot level stuff. The Jaws thing is something that you can work on, right with your own family and actually help people. And that's unusual in the kind of things you and I are interested in. The unintended consequences elsewhere usually require political action and group activities. Not much you can do to really affect the climate situation except, watch your footprint as closely as you can.
So one of the things that blew me away in the book were some of the pictures, the sort of before and after pictures of, first there's the before and after pictures like you talked about before, of you look at generations and you see the jaws recede terribly. You see the jaws recede an extraordinary, a stunning amount. But then the other thing I thought was very extraordinary was to see some of the pictures of some of the individuals who have been able to, at the very least, mitigate some of the problems and to sort of restructure their faces.
Sandra has a whole series of exercises and so on, other things that people can do to actually change the results. And also impressive are the ones, one of the ones, I don't know if you noticed it, is of this kid who had perfectly normal jaw development and then got a gerbil as a pet that he was allergic to. Ended up with long-term stuffy nose, and his jaw went to hell, and they've got the pictures to show it. So, yeah, you can, if you pay attention, if you look for the symptoms, and we have a chart, a list of things to look for in very young children to give you a clue how they're doing, and then take action, you can spare a lot of trouble, a lot of misery, and get really good results. You ought to talk to Sandra sometime, because that, of course, is her department, to say the very least.
Well, I would like to do that, and B, so in the meantime, can you go through a few of those symptoms for people to look at, and then go through some of the individual solutions? And my gosh,
well,
that's so funny with me talking to you, both of us being really big picture people, and saying the word individual solutions, but let's just let that slide.
One of the things to look for, again, there's a long list in the book, but kids should sleep, young kids should sleep quietly. You shouldn't be able to hear them breathing. Their mouth ought to be closed. The bed covers shouldn't be all messed up as if they've been squirming around. They should just go to sleep. And they should wake up energized, ready to play, and so on. You want to watch for any signs of sleeplessness and so on. If they smile, and you see a lot of gum, there's some pictures of that. A gummy smile is a bad sign. Downward growth of the face instead of forward growth is a bad sign. And again, there's lots of pictures so you can detect these things, and you don't have to wait till one of the problems with orthodontia in general is that a lot of them say, wait till all the permanent teeth are in and then we'll fix them. Well, fixing them consists of moving them around, maybe removing some, maybe making the airway even smaller. You can start when your child is, just beginning to nurse and so on, to watch for the signs. And then the cures are more difficult than standard orthodontia, because standard orthodontia is just an issue of moving the teeth around and then putting in a retainer to keep them where they were. In other words, to where you want them, because otherwise they'll just continue to move around. Teeth move through bone very nicely. Then it's a series of exercises, sometimes with an appliance, not a brace exactly, but an appliance that makes you keep your mouth shut in the right posture. And the advantage of orthodontia for cosmetic reasons is you pay your money, you get the braces, you don't have to do anything. You can use Invisalign, which is you don't even have to go to a dentist to do it. But it's temporary, and it doesn't work on the airway. The problem with the airway and keeping the airway open is it requires a lot of exercise and contribution from the patient, him or herself. The kids have to learn the count, shutting their mouths between. There's a whole series of exercises that kids can do that will give them the proper posture and will end up then with a big jaw where you don't have to move the teeth around because they'll all have room. There won't be any problem with the wisdom teeth erupting and so on. So the downside of the present cure is it requires attention on the part of children and of parents, and it's fairly long term to get the best results. If you just want a cosmetic cure and don't care whether your kid ends up barely able to breathe and gets a cardiovascular disease when he or she's in their 40s or 50s, then you just use the cosmetic treatment of the orthodontist and leave the retainer in so you look good. And you'll look good in your coffin too. So there's a positive thing there.
So can you make the connection explicit for us between the restriction of the airway passage? I presume you're talking about in the mouth and upper throat then.
Right.
And then
your airway is what normally goes from your nose down your throat into your lungs. If it becomes mouth into the lungs, then you're in trouble. Mouth breathing. First of all, the nose evolved not just to be a passageway for air, but to filter crap out of the air, warm the air, moisten the air, add bactericidal, that is, antiseptic substances to the air. So it's a very valuable thing to breathe through your nose. And nose breathing is, and the big feature of the book is how to train and talk about how to get people to be sure they're breathing through their nose, not through their mouth. And the problem with most or much of orthodonture is it tends to shorten the jaw, move the jaws back. The upper jaw may seem to you like just the base of your skull, but it's actually also movable. The so-called maxilla, the upper jaw, and the mandible have to work together. They have to know how to develop properly so the jaw, the teeth meet properly, and that means for much of the time you're not eating or talking as a child, you should have your teeth in contact. Otherwise, they don't grow properly. And so, I don't know, did I answer your question or did I just rave on?
No, that was great. That was very important. And then the question is, can you make the link between the a restricted air passage and various unexpected health problems? How does restricting the air passage...
The link is uncertain at one point, at one level. And that is, obviously, the thing you have to do and the thing that you panic immediately if you can is get air into your lungs. And the air has to go down the airway, which is in part your throat. So if you block your airway, if you reduce the airway, then you're in deep trouble. And you, for example, if it happens with your tongue slopping back into your throat when you're an obese man of 50 sleeping on your back, you are awakened by choking, and that triggers what's called your sympathetic nervous system, which is the system that's normally triggered by danger. It's the fight or flight reaction, and it shuts off part of your physiology and turns on other parts of it, and it is very stressful, particularly if one of the problems in our society is too much stress. There's a book by Robert Sapolsky, who wrote the introduction to our book, called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, if you're interested in the stress-to-health connection. And there's another book by a guy named Walker called Why We Sleep, which connects the stress-sleep health connection, which is another big one. So what we don't know is if you're awakened every night in the middle of the night by sleep apnea and you only get 5 hours of sleep a night and your sympathetic nervous system is turned on for 2 hours a night, what does that do to the odds of your getting cancer? What we do know is it increases them, but it hasn't been possible. It isn't possible, really, to do the experiments to tell you if that happens to you, what happens to your odds of getting cancer, cardiovascular disease, ADHD, any number of Alzheimer's disease, depression, and so on. So what's clear is choking is bad and stressful. What's also clear is stress is bad for you in many, many ways. And again, read Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. But the exact consequences, whether you're going to get cancer, it's just like we know from all kinds of stuff that smoking is bad for you. But some people smoke until they're 90 and die by being hit by a truck. Other people get type 2 lung cancer from somebody else smoking in their vicinity. In other words, these things are probabilistic. They depend on the individual. They depend on a lot of things. We can't make the connection. But in the same sense that in my view, and I did smoke when I was a kid, that smoking is bad for you, having a restricted airway is bad for you in the same sense. You know, I often get amused by these people who say they got lung cancer, they didn't realize smoking was bad for them. I was picking up butts on the street in the 1930s with my friends and smoking them when I was 7, 8 years old. You know what we called them? We called them coffin nails. Even at 7 or 8 years old, you knew perfectly well it wasn't going to be good for you to pull hot air and a lot of the crap into your lungs.
So before we wind this whole thing down, there's another thing that your book helped me understand that is something that's puzzled me for a long time too, which is it seemed like snoring is a tremendously bad idea evolutionarily, in that you're announcing to the world that you're asleep and essentially defenseless.
That's one of our examples in the book, because we try and be very careful about the science and what's behind various statements, besides having all the documentation of the scientific literature. That's one that's purely speculation. I tried to find out whether people who had worked with the Bushmen, for example, knew whether they snored at all, at least before they were adopted to more city-like life. And I couldn't find out. But just on pure speculation, we know, for example, that our Australopithecine ancestors lived in African savannas and were hunted by leopards. And if I were living outdoors in an area where there were leopards, I think that snoring would be a really good idea, you know? And I hope somebody someday digs up some literature or actually does some interviewing or something to find out whether hunter-gatherers, and there are very few of them left, ever snore. But my suspicion is, they didn't have the kind of diet and jaw development that would lead to snoring, and that those that did snore would be selected against, shall we say, you have to worry about them being dined on by leopards, and I think human flesh was probably quite good for leopards.
So, on that note, we have just a couple minutes left, and what, on both the macro and micro scales, what do you want people to take away from both this interview and also the book itself?
Well, first, learn for your own benefit and for your kids' benefit, but also try and push the idea that, right or wrong, we ought to be paying attention to the consistency of what we eat, how we hold our mouths, the problems of sleep apnea and so on, so that, among other things, we need our medical schools and dental schools to cooperate more, maybe even fuse. There's no reason to separate the health of your mouth and your teeth and your jaws from the health of your legs or your gallbladder or anything else. It's really a single unit designed to develop in a certain environment. And what we're learning is we're not paying the right kind of attention to the big environmental changes that affect us directly, as opposed to the very important ones that affect the rest of our environment, like toxification and climate change and loss of biodiversity and so on. This is one we can do something about, and we should put some pressure on schools to watch the diets that they feed kids in the middle of the day, and for consistency, try and fight against, get the baby food industry to make non-liquid baby foods so that kids can actually chew. There's a lot of social things we can all do that are obvious once you understand the situation. And hopefully, it's not a long book. It's a fairly obvious story. So absorb it, help your kids, help yourself, and then try and help your society to make the situation better.
Well, thank you so much for all that, and thank you for all your work. And I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Paul Ehrlich. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.